What are some of the health hazards for humans on a settlement on the moon? How does the lunar regolith impact the respiratory system? What about a long voyage to Mars or on the surface of Mars? In this episode of Chai on the Moon, we have a conversation with Dr. Martin Braddock about these issues and more. Hello, and welcome to this episode of Chai on the Moon, where we talk about societal and ethical issues related to human settlements in space, in particular on the moon. Our guest today is Dr. Martin Braddock. He has his own. He's a professional scientist, and he has his own consulting company, which I found out he started last September. It is GENIXICOLSULTIng Limited. He has published over 170 articles in many journals, including Nature, Cell, Human Gene Therapy, Nature Drug Discovery, and more recently, he has been publishing articles in astronomical journals as well, because he's passionate about astronomy. So that's always a sort of soft point for me. And he's a member of Sherwood Observatory in the UK, a fellow of the Royal Astronomical Society, a fellow of the Royal Society of Biology, and to me, I think I can safely say that this is the first time that I'm interviewing somebody who has a PhD in radiation biology. So, Dr. Braddock, welcome to Chai on the Moon.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor Hamid, and it's a great pleasure to be here, and a great pleasure to talk to you about something for me that is it's a real passion, and actually the beauty of science, I think, in the 21st century is that we can see all the fields emerging together, and that the old fashioned way of chemistry and physics and material science being separate areas is no longer the case. They actually intertwine with each other. And we're going to need that for future discoveries, and certainly for future exploration of space.
Thank you. And I think this is what this conversation is going to be about as well. And we often talk about ethical and social issues, and in some sense, medical issues are also get intertwined with that. So I thought we'll start with, I mean, our a lot of our focus is on imagining human settlements on the moon because they are not that far off. We are in striking distance, meaning to say, in a few years humans may be living on the moon. And oftentimes you focus on the ethical issues, but there are also medical or physical issues that will come up. So can you say a little bit about, from the environment perspective of the moon, what are some of the long-term challenges that we should think about in terms
Sure,
of for humans?
sure. So, I mean, I think there are a number, and probably the one that most people would think about is the lack of gravity on the moon. So the moon has approximately a sixth the gravitational field on Earth, and for those of us, probably for those of us old enough to remember the Apollo landings, you may have remembered seeing the astronauts almost bounce around the moon, because their movement, if you like, is unconstrained by Earth gravity. And it's obvious, I know, but that's a big problem for how the human body functions and how it works. And the reasons that our cardiovascular system, our heart, is so strong, hopefully in most people, if we're healthy, is that we have to fight every day against Earth's gravity to keep moving, to keep our blood flow. When we stand up, when we sit down, when we run, we're all exercising our muscles in 1G. And that's because life on Earth really doesn't know anything else. At least life on land knows nothing else. On the moon, of course, when you have a sixth of the gravity, the body doesn't have to work as hard. Why would it? There is no reason for it to do. So the cardiovascular system becomes less primed, if you like, for physical activity because the body doesn't need it. It's easier to walk around. It's like walking around on elastic on Earth. So one of the things that I think the mission planners for the future are going to have to think about is how does the human body maintain its function and structure such that when people come back to Earth, they're able to come back and resume a normal life. Now, again, I know I'm probably speaking to not that many people who can remember the return from astronauts from the moon. But actually, when you think about it, even returning astronauts back from the space shuttle, certainly from the International Space Station, you will never see an astronaut walk away when he or she lands back on Earth. And that's simply because it's physically impossible for them to do it. If they've been in space a long period of time, they will have lost some bone structure. It's on average between 1 and 1.5% bone mass per month in space. They will have lost muscle structure. And if you've ever broken a limb, a leg, or an arm, and you've taken a plaster cast off after 6 weeks or even 12 weeks, if you're unlucky with a complex fracture, you'll look at your arm and your leg and you'll think, where's my muscle gone? It's not there. And of course, that's because the limb isn't being stressed any longer while it's immobilized. And that's what happens to astronauts. They lose bone mass, they lose muscle mass. And you can imagine losing 1 to 1.5% of bone mass per month, what that could mean. So that's in microgravity, that's on the International Space Station. What that could mean, even if you're in a sixth of the gravitational field on Earth, say for 3, 6, maybe even 12 months, if you're a 12-month stint, that's going to have quite a consequence on your body when you return to Earth. So the other challenge, I think, for mission planners is to think certainly about how do we maintain our physical prime, if you like, in a low gravity environment. And that's bone mass, muscle mass, the cardiovascular system. We also have challenges with astronaut vision, again, from our understanding of astronauts on the International Space Station. Their vision is affected. I think I remember reading it's up to 80% of astronauts will report some impaired vision at some time. And that's simply because the structure of the eye that we have as a near spherical shape on Earth doesn't retain its spherical shape in microgravity. It becomes squashed, and that squashing means that the optic nerve at the back of the eye tends to be disturbed, and that can cause some visual problems. And that takes time to go back to normal. And in some cases, it takes a long time to go back to normal. Astronauts will need to have some sort of spectacles or glasses or what have you when they come back. So that's another problem. I think probably the problem that's specific to the moon is the issue of what we call lunar regolith. So this is the fine particulate dust on the
Yeah.
surface of the moon.
Martin, can I, if I can go back, come back to the lunar regolith? I mean, I have two questions regarding that. One is, um, but are there? I mean, you mentioned about the cardiovascular of a challenge of coming back to the Earth. I mean, I'm
Yep.
just curious. I mean, if you stay there, I mean, hypothetically, I mean, of course, moon probably people are going to come back and forth. But if you stay there, are there any issues with that going? So, for example, from Earth's gravity 1G to sixth gravity, is it good for you? I mean, in some sense, like I mean, without coming back, is it helpful?
It's a good question, and I think it's multifaceted because it's not just the gravity, the effects of gravity itself. It's the effect that, to all intents and purposes, you're in a sterile environment. So your body is not challenged any further with microbes that we enjoy on Earth.
Oh,
And I say enjoy because
right.
they're what keeps our immune system primed. And you could foresee what could happen. And this has been shown in certainly in mouse studies. Mice kept on the International Space Station, when they go through generations, develop what's called a T cell repertoire in their immune system that subtly changes over time. So that implies that those animals, and therefore potentially human beings, should we were to stay in a almost a sterile environment for a period of time, our immune system would become less able to attack any of the microbes that it may come across. So I think there's the gravitational aspect, but there's also the immune system aspect. And I know Brian Crucian and many of his colleagues and peers have published extensively on that. And that is one of the issues that astronauts face, even on the International Space Station, is that for 6 months at a time, that they're not, if you like, bombarded by the same number of microbes that we are on a daily basis on Earth. So that I think is also a problem too. I think the probably the most difficult problem at the moment is the likelihood that astronauts will be exposed to ionizing and cosmic radiation. And although the levels are certainly acceptable for relatively short periods of time, there's no doubt that mission planners have to build in the capacity for shielding if settlements are to be based on the surface of the moon. And many of the ideas that NASA and ESA and the other space agencies are coming up with is the possibility of some hybrid surface stroke subterranean type habitats where there is protection from the regolith itself or from the rock structure, and even the possibility of using lava tubes that have been identified on the moon as a way of affording natural protection. So that's one thing. And then the last thing, of course, is that we need to think about is because the moon has virtually no atmosphere, it is bombarded with micrometeorites on a very regular basis. And it's quite easy to find just actually some of the damage that has done to structures that have been left on the surface of the moon over time. And again, without the inertia of an atmosphere slowing down a micrometeorite, it's quite possible that some form of habitat will need strengthening and be resistant to micrometeorite bombardment. If that wasn't challenging enough, of course, we have temperature extremes. And of course, there's no doubt that the excess cold temperature on the moon will also pose quite a challenge for future habitat construction and also the maintenance of what we called a bioregenerative life support system, which is what's being considered both for the moon and for Mars.
Okay. All right. So we'll come back to the radiation second. By the way, Kim Stanley Robinson, the science fiction author, he has a book, Aurora, which actually argues pretty much against multi-generational interstellar travel
Yeah.
because of microbe evolution. Because he
Yes,
says, like, that you're a very small system and microbes are going to evolve much faster than humans will, and so we won't
certainly.
have defenses against those. Uh, so let's. You had mentioned the regolith. So I should mention that you have a chapter in the human factor in the settlement of the moon, and your chapter is hazards of lunar regolith for respiratory, central nervous system, cardiovascular, and ocular function. I will put a link to the book in the description of the video. So for the moon, as you mentioned, regolith has a particular challenge to it. So can you say a little bit about that? I mean, and why
Sure.
that, especially for health systems?
Yes, certainly. So the regolith itself. So what is regolith to start off with? So regolith is really the very fine surface layer that we see on the surface of the moon. And it's no secret now that when the Apollo missions were being planned, mission planners didn't know how deep the regolith was. Was it a few inches or centimeters, or could it have been several meters? And when the first lunar vehicles touched down, they weren't sure would the feet sink into the regolith or would they find a solid surface. And of course, as we know, they find a solid surface. But the regolith itself has been produced by bombardment, again by micrometeorites, of the igneous rock on the surface of the moon. And this, to all intents and purposes, is very fine particles. In some cases, there are components of borosilicate glass. So these are particles that almost immediately you can see could be a real challenge if they're inhaled, because they range in particle size diameter. Some will get caught in the throat, and then as we find on Earth, if it's dust, you can cough it up and that's fine. Some will travel deep into the airways, and of course some will travel very deep into the airways and be lodged there and almost never actually emerge from the respiratory system. So the possibility of astronauts inhaling what are effectively sharp glass particles, in its simplest term, is actually quite high if that regolith is brought back into a settlement or a lunar module or what have you. So we have to find ways, and mission planners have to find ways to prevent that happening, and accept the fact that, of course, they won't be 100% successful. So we then have to have some way of monitoring what the effects are. So that's the respiratory system, and certainly, if I remember correctly, Gene Cernan, one of the original Apollo astronauts, experienced the equivalent of lunar hay fever. And just imagine how frightening it must have been in those early days not to be able to breathe. And if I remember rightly, his eyes were watering. It's a little bit like if you suffer from hay fever on Earth, you're in a particularly bad way unless you can take medication quite quickly. And of course, astronauts do have medication, certainly on board the International Space Station, as they did in some limited form in the Apollo missions. But nevertheless, it's something that we need to avoid. And at all costs, it's something that I think, should these particles get into the eyes and the ears, you can see that there could be the possibility for some form, I think, of irritation, inflammation, and possibly long-term damage. So there's been quite a lot of work conducted in animals, certainly with both authentic lunar regolith and what many organizations have now started to generate a lunar regolith simulants, because there is a limit of the amount of authentic regolith that was brought back from the Apollo missions. And this work has generated what's called a minimum tolerated dose for animal studies, either in live animals or in animal cells. And I think we have a fairly good idea, at least in the short term, of what type of exposure to protect astronauts from. But of course, what we have no idea about is what type of exposure to protect astronauts from in the longer term, because all our missions on the Earth to date have been days rather than weeks, let alone months. So I think this in its own right poses quite a problem. But the immediate challenge, of course, given what we know today, is to avoid regolith coming into contact with astronauts where humanly possible.
So what happens? They are made up of shard glass. In some sense, sort of like, and they're like that. They act like that. It's silica. Uh, and I know. I think Neil Armstrong, right in the Apollo 11 one, when they had gone back into the lander while they were there, they said that it smelled like burnt
Yeah, gunpowder.
something,
Yes.
gunpowder.
Yep.
But so certainly they brought it in, they inhaled it,
Yep.
and they were there for, and the other the 12 astronauts that have been there have been very short period of time. But two questions: one, did they have those later on? Was it with them, like, next months or few months? And second, what happens? So for example, yes, it goes into the respiratory system. What would happen? Is it expected to sort of like, puncture some uh lung, sort of like,
Yep. Yep.
capsules, or what happens? Yeah.
Yeah. So there is the possibility for some sort of lower lung structure in the alveolus. There is some possibility for scarring and for damage, simply because these sharp particles will cause inflammation. So the immediate response is an anti-inflammatory is the need for anti-inflammatories to prevent inflammation. But longer term, in much the same way that silica particles and asbestos particles do damage to the lungs, we might expect that over long periods of time. I think that the saving grace for astronauts that have experienced this so far is exactly as you said, Salman. They've been exposed for days rather than weeks. So the likelihood is that they'll have removed naturally most of those particles. But I would be surprised if they have all been completely removed, and that the overall concentration or the overall exposure that they've had has been relatively low, simply because of the duration of the period that they've spent there. So they're unlikely, I would have thought, to suffer any long-term consequences. But this is what mission planners need to plan for, of course. If we're looking at a year's mission on the
Yeah.
moon, and for astronauts to come and go in and out of habitats to avoid that contamination, in the same way that we would expect to avoid contamination from any agent, whether or not it be a microbial or a dust contaminant.
So, I mean, to me, it seems like a pretty tough thing to do. I know the lunar mission, the one, I think the one that was not successful just now, Intuitive Machines, or maybe the one that has been successful. One of the things it is trying to do is to figure out sort of like uh, electromagnetically if it can actually get rid of some of the regolith.
Yeah,
Like,
yeah,
so they are trying to figure out how to clean it, because this is not just for biology, but it's also for instruments, for example. It's very sticky.
yeah.
So, uh, so can it be done? I mean, can you? I mean, you cannot have 100% clean record in terms of lunar regolith if you have a lunar settlements over there. So, what are the odds, and what if it's not? What level of what would be acceptable level? Will we be able to live that? Hey, a little bit of regolith comes in, like, and you live over there.
Yeah, so I mean, I think there's two ways that we have to think about this, and I think the first way is, can we prevent regolith being imported in the first instance? And there's several ways of doing this, and um, these have impact, of course, for life on Earth. And I think, in their own right, this is what helps the technological development and the development of the material science. So I think the first thing is to think about non-adherent spacesuits. So having spacesuits that naturally repel dust particles, because they are electrostatically charged and they do become sticky. So developing materials that will repel that charge, and then develop surfaces that are modified in such a way to repel the charge will be a big help. That's one thing. The other thing that agencies are thinking about are carbon dioxide showers. So effectively, when an astronaut would come in from the outside, he or she would be blasted with carbon dioxide. That would take the regolith off the spacesuit itself, and it would be extracted through a filtration system outside of the habitat. So that's a third way. Another way would be an electrostatic neutralizer, either with a curtain or a gun. And there is a system called Sparkle that NASA and a number of companies are developing, or even the possibility of next generation filters, photovoltaic electrodes that would, in some way, be able to drastically reduce the amount of regolith. But I think, as we've been saying, there's no doubt that there is going to be not 100% removal of regolith. So we're going to have to accept, at least to some extent, that regolith is going to find its way into the habitat. So if we think now then about, well, how can we measure the effect that is happening? And I think in part, we're well used to looking at inflammatory disease with many conditions on Earth. So it would not be hard for scientists to develop a symptoms and duration scoring analog. And we can do that simply by extrapolating what patients who have asthma or COPD, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, or possibly rhinitis and hay fever experience on Earth. So being able to record how are you feeling, how can we measure it? Can we measure what is called your fraction, your FEV1, your forced expiratory volume in 1 second, i.e., when you breathe out,
Mm.
what is the volume of air that you breathe out during that 1 second? And then can we use some of the biomarkers that we've developed on Earth to detect airway inflammation? And one of those biomarkers is a biomarker called FeNO. And I've used this together with my colleagues in drug development for patients who are taking new asthma medications. It's called fraction excreted nitric oxide, and it's simply a proxy for inflammation. And people who have asthma generally have over 25 parts per billion FeNO. Hopefully, if you don't have asthma, you should be well below that. But it's not uncommon for severe asthmatics to have very, very high FeNO concentrations, even into the thousands. So we have some way of understanding if a astronaut is exposed to regolith and they have an inflammatory response, can we measure it? And then what can we do about it? Well, we could give astronauts the anti-inflammatory agents that we use on Earth for asthma and for COPD via an inhaler, which in its own right may pose some challenges, particularly in a reduced gravity environment. But nevertheless,
Mm.
those drugs are available, or for astronauts to have orally available drugs. And there is also some technology that is being looked into for the assessment of neurotoxicity, which again is a hypothetical concern, but not yet a concern. So I think taken together, we have to accept that sure there is going to be a risk. There's no doubt that there would be a risk. But I think, given what we know about respiratory disease in patients on Earth, or you and I, should we go to the doctor with a respiratory complaint, I think we can work around the likelihood of exposure until we get more data. So with that, there is an inherent risk here, and this is of course this is what astronauts have to accept and do accept as being the pioneers. Of course, there's a risk, but these guys and women are paving the way for the future. And it's our responsibility as mission planners and scientists and material scientists and physicians on Earth to give them the best possible chance of an outcome. But nevertheless, we are setting new standards here for the future. And hopefully, if we set them low enough, then astronauts will return in good health and maintain good health. But we won't know until I think we try. But I don't think we're going into this blind, if you like. I think we've got a lot of information to guide us, and hopefully we will be over prepared rather than under prepared, and that this will become a non-issue. I think when you look at the challenges that the space agencies had to go through to actually get people to the moon in the first place, these almost look quite trivial, but nevertheless,
Mm.
when we're thinking about human beings exposed to all sorts of things in an extreme environment, possibly for months at a time, we've got to do our best to give them the safest outcome possible, because that's going to guide future research as well, of course, as maintaining their personal health and bringing them back safely.
This is so. I find it so fascinating that moon, the first thing you think about is its barrenness and its lack of life, and it's absolutely no greenery. It's like, it's dark, or it's black, or sort of a gray. And then you talk about hay fever. So I actually get sort of like, spring allergies, and this is spring right now, and so I relate to that. And a couple of years ago, I had a much severe thing. Now, because of medication, it can be controlled. But for me, spring is the best time. So you go like, oh, this is so amazing. You're coming
Yeah,
out of winter, and immediately you start seeing life everywhere. You
yeah,
go like, okay, I can smell life and I can start coughing. And so to think about that for the moon, that to me, it's just so weird because that people can develop a similar kind of response, but
yeah.
because of inhaling that again, it irritates your respiratory system. So, can I ask you one other thing in the same range? So, you mentioned about the respiratory system, and but what about other aspects in terms of neurological issues or other things that can be impacted? You had mentioned about the low gravity impact on eyes. I mean, this does this regolith impact other systems as well, or is it just primarily the respiratory?
Yeah, so I think we have to be prepared to accept the fact that there may be gastrointestinal disturbance as well, because we'll swallow regolith. So part of the normal activity, if you like, is when we breathe in dust, it'll make us cough, get it out of the throat, but it's a natural thing then to swallow it. So there will be some exposure in the GI tract, for example. And my bet is, and certainly the animal studies have shown this so far, is again, it will be something similar, which is low grade inflammation, hopefully that will be controlled. It will be at low level and low exposure. The other possibility is that particles travel into the bloodstream through the lungs. And because they're small enough, they penetrate what's called the blood brain barrier. And most things, of course, don't penetrate the blood brain barrier, but viruses can, for example, which is why we sometimes have neurological disturbances. So it's not impossible that very small regolith particles will penetrate the blood brain barrier. And again, if astronauts are exposed to a high level for long enough, it seems natural to me that there is the risk of some form of neurodegeneration, or at least some sort of um, neuroconditioning that may not be optimal. And again, I think we just have to monitor for that, and again do our utmost to reduce exposure as much as possible. But I think we should be looking at regolith particles in the same way that we look at any small um, foreign component, if you like, is that it will find a way to get into the body. It's almost a foregone conclusion. So let's be vigilant and let's plan for the worst in whatever way we can, and then ultimately cease exposure at high levels where possible, and try and get them down to as low as possible.
So, if you look at it more broadly, you also mentioned radiation. So, usually people think about the moon in terms of the threat from radiation exposure.
Yeah,
And so, when people are talking about the habitats, the primary focus goes into, well, okay, how can it be protected from that? Regolith also play a big role in it. What do you see? I mean, obviously, from what you are saying, you don't think that these are insurmountable issues. But what do you see for long term habitation on the moon? Is there something that's a bigger threat, radiation or exposure
yeah.
to regolith? Yeah.
I mean, I think that the biggest threat is certainly that of radiation and temperature extremes.
Right.
And as we said a little bit earlier, micro meteorite bombardment and destruction of health support systems. So I'm not necessarily thinking that astronauts themselves would be hit by micrometeorites, but
Mm.
it's the supporting infrastructure for the habitat, for example. So I think we need to think about. I think we need to think about hybrid structures where we use as much natural protection as we possibly can, which could be using lava tubes.
Yeah.
It could be building habitats partially underground. Um, I, I, I think it would be very challenging indeed, as it would on Mars for that matter, to build surface habitats where we are depending almost, if you like, on our structure that we make ourselves rather than using what's naturally available. So the terminology for all of these things is ISRU, or in situ resource utilization, and it is what it says, which is when you get there, you make the best of what you've got. And if you have some natural building blocks, if you like, with subterranean structures, then you use them. And ESA have done some very nice modeling. The European Space Agency have done some very nice modeling on lava tubes and how they could be used and constructed as habitats. But I think it's nice to see the mock-ups, of course, the practice of putting these in place. Well, that's way away from us, at least at the moment.
And you will also need to have, I mean, one of the challenges is that right now, at least, most of the water ice is in the permanently shadowed regions at the
Yeah.
South
Yep.
Pole or on the
Yes.
North Pole, and so the lava tubes have to be close to that, otherwise
Yep.
you won't have access to that. uh,
Yep.
so let's pivot a little bit, because you mentioned Mars, and of course, with the current situation in the U.S. in particular, there might be more interest in Mars. We don't know. There's a lot of chaos here, to be frank. Uh, but uh, but Mars, of course, is seen as really a more permanent step for humanity. I mean, Moon is
Yeah.
still considered as perhaps a research base, technical base, commercial base, but not a permanent colony type situation. But Mars is seen as that, and Mars certainly has more gravity than the Moon, less
Yep.
than the Earth, but it also has huge dust storms. So if we
Yep.
just pivot with the conversation about the regolith to the potential, how is the dust on Mars different, similar to Earth or to the Moon, or what would be the challenge over there?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, and unfortunately, of course, we don't have authentic Martian regolith to work with.
Yeah.
But companies have tried to type Earth substances to produce Martian regolith simulants as much as we possibly can. So this and how this is done is simply by the spectral analysis that we can get from spacecraft as they fly by Mars, or now actually, of course, as we've got Martian landers, they can transmit back information on what's in the Martian regolith. And we can try and match that as much as possible on Earth. So there's two challenges. So the first challenge is the substance itself, and Martian regolith is not that dissimilar from lunar regolith. The one challenge that it brings, I mean, it has iron in it, which of course gives it its reddish color. But what it has in it as well that lunar regolith doesn't have is an iron called perchlorate, and perchlorate is really not good news for growing crops, and certainly can induce gestational challenges in animals. I don't know whether any people have been exposed to perchlorate, but I would guess that they will have done at some point by accident, because perchlorate is naturally found on Earth. And interestingly, it's naturally found on Earth at the sites of high velocity rocket takeoff. So perchlorate can naturally be found at relatively higher concentrations around where rockets have left the Earth. So there are natural sources of perchlorate on Earth. And that means, actually, quite interestingly, is that life has evolved on Earth with some extremophiles that can be used for what's called bioremediation and the removal of perchlorate. So there are bacteria that exist that can remove perchlorate. So, what this is starting to suggest to the eyes of synthetic biologists is, would it be possible to overcome the perchlorate challenge in Martian regolith, not en masse, not on the surface of the planet, but within the confines of a habitat, by using bioremediative bacteria, which would either remove perchlorate, which is what we want. But I know that there is some work in the UK, and I'm sure there is elsewhere in the world, that's trying to design bacteria that will remove perchlorate, but also fix nitrogen. So the possibility of bacterial involvement, albeit on a small scale, to help Martian regolith become more amenable to crop growth, which is ultimately the aim, for human consumption, because we want to take perchlorate out of the regolith so that crops will grow and the perchlorate won't get into the crop so that people can eat it. So there is some possibility, I think, of augmenting regolith at the same way as decontaminating it. Now, the beauty, of course, about Mars is that it has about a third the gravitational field on Earth, as you were alluding to, Salman, which is we're in better shape, at least as far as the gravitational field is concerned. The downside, of course, is that it's that much further away. Well, getting there, we haven't done it, of course, as we know, at least not with people. I've lost track a little bit, I confess, as to what the estimated date is now for the first manned woman mission to Mars. It's likely, I think, to be. It's certainly not going to be by the end of this decade, I would doubt. So I think we're probably well into the 2030s before we see it as feasible. But of course, within the challenge of that type of voyage comes, of course, the distance and the time that astronauts would be in a low gravity environment, a microgravity environment, on board whatever spaceship is going to get them there, the time that they're on the surface of Mars, and then the time that they need to come back. And I know from having seen some of the data that NASA and ESA have published is that this causes real challenges with the lifetime radiation exposure limits for both men and women. And that even a 3 to 6 month voyage, let's assume that we have 1 month on the surface of Mars, and then it's likely, I think, if I remember rightly, to be about 200 days or maybe 180 days coming back. Of course, depending on the window of the organization of Mars versus the Earth. So we're looking at a long period of time. And that in its own right poses probably a bigger challenge with respect to radiation exposure than it does on the surface of the moon. So we've got something else to think about there. Now, interestingly, there's one other thing that I find absolutely fascinating, and of course, is that we all know that there is a time delay between sending a signal from Earth to wherever it is, and the time is longer the further away it is, etc., because of the speed of electromagnetic radiation. But it really didn't occur to me until only about 18 months ago how big the time difference can be between the Earth and Mars as Mars rotates around the Earth, because, of course, it's not fixed. So the actual time delay, depending on whether Mars is in opposition or conjunction, can be anywhere up to 30 minutes for a signal to go from the Earth to Mars and then back again. So that in its own right causes quite a challenge that there is no way that we can get round simply because of the laws of physics. So if you have an emergency on the surface of Mars, depending on where you are relative to Earth, you're going to have to wait minutes for certain, tens of minutes, more than likely, to be able to send your question and get an answer back. So this is going to pose, I think, quite a challenge for not just astronaut physical health, but also for astronaut mental health, because they'll want to talk to loved ones and family and parents and mission planners while they're on the surface of Mars. And I think that's one yet that we've not really we've faced it as a challenge, but we've not really come up with, as far as I'm aware, a good solution for being able to tackle it. So that will be an interesting one, because of course we are bound here by the laws of physics. And the only way, I think, of getting around this is having, if you like, for key questions that would involve colonist health, it would be to have a repository of information accessible not too far away from the planet, so that questions can be asked to her. It would be the equivalent, I guess, of a chatbot orbiting the planet, and for that information to come back again.
Yeah, and that's what worries me about what that chatbot is going to give back information. So I mean, like,
Yeah.
if it's the AI like thing, and again, so so that's interesting, and also, I mean, you were mentioning about the timing of Mars mission, because that will also be correlated with the activity cycle of the sun. Because if
Yep.
it is solar maximum, for example, like we are going through right now, I mean, that would not be the best time, because the likelihood of solar storms happening, and there won't be much protection on the way to Mars. But it triggers one of the question in my mind. You mentioned psychological aspects on the moon. I know that astronauts, I've read about that, sort of like, that they thought, I mean, because you can see the curvature very easily, and it's a
Yep.
little weird because of getting your, and you don't have other structures to give you reference in the way our mind does here on Earth. I'm curious, does that lead to psychological issues for back to the moon in terms of long term habitation, where they are living in a different structure where our brains are not used to, and you
Mm.
are looking at the horizon, for example?
Yep.
Does that impact somehow? Do you think that would impact psychologically?
Yeah, and I think these are great questions, and I what my thinking is that we've not really tackled in a I don't think in a complete way any of the psychological issues that are likely to happen to any of us in a situation that's probably negative at some time. And we all go through troughs in our lives, and we're only human after all. So we need to have some way of being able to manage and cope with that stress. It's natural. So and also I think the question that's been posed to me many times is what would it be like not to smell the types of things that we love to smell on Earth? So whether it's your favorite cooking, whether it's a flower, whether or not it's, well, possibly not if you've got hay fever, but whether or not it's popcorn,
Uh,
candy,
uh,
the smell of a glass of wine, a beer, an orange. What is it like not to have that? And how does that play on your mind? And I know NASA has been doing some work isolating some of the chemical substances in freshly cut grass, I remember reading, and trying to think about, does it help astronauts mentally cope with not being in an Earth environment if they experience some of the aromas and perhaps some of the sounds that we would experience on Earth. So again, if anybody has seen the original Total Recall film with Arnold Schwarzenegger in it, you may remember in his apartment he has, if I remember correctly, a full scale wall LED TV, and the image can change from being a cityscape to a mountainscape. And I wonder if psychologically we have to help colonists overcome the fact that they're no longer on Earth by giving them things that will help them have that frame of reference, but gradually wean them off it such that they come to accommodate that a Martian landscape or a lunar landscape or perhaps at some distant point in the future, an exoplanet landscape is going to be their norm. But this is something that psychologically, I'm not sure how on earth we tackle that because everybody's different. We can't put in place screening criteria for colonists to predict how they're going to behave in 6 months' time because we don't know what stresses we may react to. But nevertheless, I think this is something that could become quite a serious issue because it could threaten not just the personal health of the colonist, but it could threaten the health of his or her colleagues if they decide, for example, that they can't mentally cope with the environment any longer and start to become disruptive or even destructive.
I think Antarctica, when people go over there for the research station, they have a pretty
Yeah.
sort of like, strenuous psychological test, because especially if you are going to plan on spending the southern winter over there, because there is
Yes.
no way of coming back, and they
Yep.
do that. But of course, moon on Mars would be much more extreme. And there are, I mean, this concept of biophilia, I mean, like, it shows up sometimes in movies. I mean, you mentioned Total Recall. I also remember the movie Moon, where
Mm.
there is sort of like, person is actually just doing a little bit of gardening type thing in a small thing, or creating some stuff. So I think that would be a serious challenge. So
Yes.
we are getting close to the end. I want to ask you another question, uh, something related to that, and you also have a paper on that, and I'm going to link to that, and that is about bioethical issues for human modification.
Yep.
uh, to me, when people talk about, which I think is crazy. There are a lot of issues with that. Terraforming Mars, for example, like, we have no clue on that level, which we can do. But people say, and end of Total Recall, which was unfortunate, but it was about sort of like, spoiler, but it, like, there's a big nuclear explosion, and it creates the atmosphere relatively quickly, which doesn't happen anyway. But to me, the more likely situation is going to be about modifying humans, and that has been coming out. uh, Perhaps genes from these radiation resistant microbes, like the tardigrades, which is the favorite of now of a lot of enthusiasts for space travel, for science fiction as well. That maybe we can use that, use CRISPR technology to bring it in, or something like that,
Yep.
so how do you see human modification, uh, from ethical perspective as well, but also from success perspective? I mean, is it effective? And so should we do that? And of course, there is the question is in two parts, because one is, if they don't come back, of course, coming back to Earth can cause problems. But if we are thinking about one way, that if you are going to Mars, we modify you, we put tardigrade infused gene, whatever is in there, you are a little bit different color, maybe, to work with that radiation environment. Does that work, and is there an issue with that?
Oh boy. Well, this yes, and this is something that certainly. So, a good friend and co-author Konrad Skozik,
Yeah.
who the paper was with, who's at the University of Rezau Institute of Technology Management, and who I'm going to see in 2 weeks' time. Um, and um, I'm working with him on several new projects. So Conrad is an ethicist. So I'm the scientist, Conrad's the ethicist, and actually it's a great partnership
and
because
I,
I
and
will.
I, and I should mention, he's the editor here too for
Yes, he's the
this,
editor.
for the human settlements,
Yes,
human
thank you,
factor in human settlements.
thank you. So he's so we come up with these concepts and ideas together with other like-minded people, and I'll come up with the scientific part, and Conrad will come up with the ethical part, and we'll start to work through it. And this is such an interesting one because there's little doubt that humans are genetically already advantaged in some way, depending on where they're born. So, for example, residents of the high Tibetan plateau, I mean, it sounds obvious, I know, but they have gene changes that allow them to trap more oxygen in there with their hemoglobin, which is why they're able to work quite happily at altitudes that you and I would not be happy with, and would experience altitude sickness. And actually, we might die if we were exposed to these altitudes very quickly. They've adapted to that, and they've adapted to that genetically. So they are, if you like, already pre-programmed to live in those environments. And of course, the question that's the favorite one of everybody now, which is, well, given that it's possible to manipulate genes via gene editing, at least on a relatively simple basis at present, would it ever be possible to engineer human beings to become resistant to whatever it may be? And now scientists appear to have unlocked how Deinococcus radiodurans, the tardigrade, is able to thrive in very, very high doses of radiation, not because it has a magical lead shield that it puts around it or anything like that. It has what's called a damage suppressor protein that's able to repair its DNA very quickly. So it still gets damaged in the same way that other cells would do, but it's able to repair the damage to the DNA very quickly and able to grow and live in these conditions. So the 64,000 or probably $64 million question is, can you engineer human cells to become resistant to radiation? And lo and behold, scientists found that if you cloned the gene, which they did, and they put it into human cells and exposed them to radiation, they became less susceptible. I won't say resistant, but less susceptible to radiation damage. So that begs the question, could it ever be done in animals to start off with and then human beings? Now, where Conrad and I started thinking through this is, well, what would ever prompt that to happen in the first place? Why would you ever do that to a human being? And the idea of doing that to a human being simply to see, could it be done? I'm not sure would ever pass any form of regulatory muster, if you like. I mean, I guess if it's yourself and you're prepared to accept the risk, then it's up to you. Good luck and see what happens. But for it to be actually a scientifically controlled, regulated, medically accepted process, what would prompt it to happen? So the types of things that we were musing about, well, if the Earth was facing some form of existential threat, for example, whether or not it be the next pandemic or some form of, heaven forbid, nuclear or germ warfare or whatever, and we see that the only way, or one of the only ways, for the human species to survive, is to actually build a settlement on Mars, and therefore we have to protect people the best way possible. Is it ever justifiable to start to do these types of experiments? And I think even then the question comes with, yeah, but what if? What if it doesn't work? What if we induce permanent damage to somebody's DNA structure by somatic gene editing, or even worse, germline gene editing, where we can't go back? So I think it's a great concept. It's one that will be with us for many, many, many years to come. Ethically, I think it's challenging ethically, but I think even if you put the ethics to one side, the regulatory constraints around doing it such that it would have medical acceptance to be done not just as a curiosity, but as a natural process, to design colonists that are already um, at their peak of fitness, because I think the first colonists are likely to be the types of people that we see on space missions today, ultra fit athletes, whether they're male or female. I think it's a very, very long way off. So for me, it's a scientific possibility. Why I think it's very interesting, of course, is that it's drawing along the whole field of gene editing on Earth, and that in its own right, I think, is the real benefit, because gene editing is yet to be proven. Gene therapy has taken a long time to take off as an accepted therapy for human beings on Earth. There are now many gene therapy products approved, but we're still yet to see that made accessible to patients on a more global level. So I think for gene editing, the initial studies that are being done in very rare and extreme diseases, particularly diseases of the eye, in haemophilia, hopefully in cystic fibrosis one day, possibly even Huntington's chorea, they will pave the way. If it can be done on a more acceptable basis and regulated, and the long-term safety effects studied, then it might become more of a value proposition for colonists for the future. But I think we've got a long time to wait yet before we see that as being acceptable. And that doesn't take into account then the ethics of, is it even right to think about it, let alone do it?
Yeah, I mean, I remember Stephen Hawking's book, Universe in a Nutshell. So Stephen Hawking had
Yes, yep.
done cameos in on Star Trek: The Next Generation because he loved Star Trek, and he in one of the episodes he was on the holodeck. So he actually wrote about that, and he said the most unbelievable thing about Star Trek, and so Star Trek: The Next Generation was set up in 24th century, and he said the most unbelievable thing about the Next Generation were the humans. because his point was that by 24th century the likelihood that humans are going to look like humans today, it's pretty small, and partly because of the potential to modify humans. And so by that time, if we could do it, we would do it, even setting aside the ethical issues. People will push for that. So that to me is just
Yep.
an interesting concept of on the scales of hundreds of years, but
Yes.
I
Yep.
think that may be there. I'm just curious on the broader sense. We are talking about the settlements on the moon, of course, Mars as well, that comes up. But if we just focus on the moon, uh, we are in this series, we are looking at sociological, ethical, legal aspects for human settlements. How do you personally see the future on the moon? Do you see it taking place as we think it would? Do you have concerns about it? Do you think there would be aspects that may make human settlements unnecessary, maybe perhaps just robots there? How do you see the future on the moon?
So I think there's a couple of things I'd like to raise in answer to that question. And I think the first one is the way that the space agencies and private enterprise now that's becoming much more involved is seeing construction of habitats on the moon is in part by 3D printing. So the concept now of sending robots to the moon to get them to reconstruct or to construct the building blocks, if you like, and they almost would be literally building blocks. I'll just close the curtain here as we have the appearance of something large and orange in the UK, which is always welcome. We've not seen it that much over this last day or so. Um, but the prospect here, I think, of construction of habitats via 3D printers, I think has gained a lot of credibility. And it's gained a lot of credibility by what we can do on Earth, but it's also gained a lot of credibility by some studies that have been done using solar power to drive the production of a sintered regolith. So if you imagine now the types of scenarios where we could have at least structures pre-assembled, perhaps, ready for colonists or astronauts to come to assemble them. I think that that's a real possibility. I think the real reason, of course, is that we want to colonize the moon is as a stepping stone to Mars. So I think it, to me at least, it makes sense to do that. It makes sense to iron out all of these problems such that we're able to get astronauts back in an emergency, hopefully get them back in an emergency, and not wait for these problems that could be quite insurmountable when we get to Mars happening then, but rather let them happen on the moon where we can mitigate against any of the risk. So I see that as being something that is really on the horizon, and I'm certainly hopeful by the end of this decade that we'll see some major inroads into the concepts of 3D printing and construction and robotics. And I think where this is really helpful is that for the moon and most certainly for Mars, we're looking at a huge positive here for global sustainability because we are constrained by obviously what we can take off the surface of the Earth by our gravitational field and the huge cost of taking materials. So this is going to force us to recycle in a way that perhaps, at least in the Western world, we take for granted as something that we don't do. If something breaks, you just throw it out and you buy another one. I mean, it's a sad endorsement of society, but it's nevertheless the case. Partly because there aren't that many people around now who can fix things, and it's certainly in a car, in an automobile. When I go to the garage and take my car, they say, "Yeah, well, you know that this has gone. It's all electronic now. We can't fix it. It's actually cheaper to take it out, throw it out, and we'll replace it." And I think certainly for materials, that's going to have to change for any form of colonization on the moon and on Mars. And if we can force ourselves to do that and then re-import that technology and that thinking back to how we generate for want of a better word, waste and recycle it or not recycle it on Earth, that has to have huge benefits, I think, for the whole of global society. Because with every passing year, as the global population increases, as research in longevity enables us to live longer lives, um, it's going to pose, I think, an inevitable problem. Is that hand in hand have to come our acknowledgement that the Earth is a finite, has a finite resource, and that anything that we can do that improves our sustainability index is going to be helpful. So I think for me, this is almost, if you like, a justification for space exploration, which is that it helps us back on Earth, not just with our healthcare, but also with our attitudes towards sustainability, and our need to recognize that there is a finite amount of resource that we have, and that we better find a way of reusing as much as possible as we can.
Great. No, thank you so much for that. And one last thing. Have you watched shows like For All Mankind or
Yeah, yeah,
oh,
yep,
okay, all right. So I'm
yeah.
just curious because that has. Uh, I mean, they do get medical issues, but I'm curious. Do you find it sort of like addressing some of the things that uh, from your work? I mean, like are they in the ballpark range? Are they okay, or are they missing points? I mean, I find it
No,
interesting. Yeah.
I think so. I mean, I see. I see another future, and this is one that, together with Conrad and another set of colleagues, we're thinking through, is the possibility that space exploration in the future won't necessarily be in the human form that we are
Right.
today.
Right.
I know this has been a passion of many science fiction writers over the years, but actually now it's becoming more science fact. And I mean, every day I am just totally astonished by some of the advances in human robotics. And I know there is a lot of worry and fear about it, but you can't stop it. So there's no point trying to bury your head in the sand. It's going to happen. We have to make sure that it happens in a way that can be controlled and also in a way that benefits people. But the possibility of generative AI and autonomous robots, I think, is a lot closer than we think. And I think that the possibility of using these types of avatars, I believe is the word for it, as explorers in environments where it's not safe to send human beings, makes perfect sense. And I know I'm one of these people who is. I'm a real sucker for the Boston Dynamics website. I actually love some of the guys there, the work that they're doing there, and I just think this is just staggering. And I know it's showing the best of things, but it's showing real progress. I know there are many tech firms in China who are making very, very big inroads in the robotics area. And yeah, this it's great. Let's see it happen. But please, my plea as a Brit is, guys, let's come together, whatever nation you're in, because we're all here, hopefully for the long term together. And we need to pool our efforts and thinking and resources, because um, the human ingenuity can solve anything if it puts its mind to it, but it needs to be together, not apart.
Well, on that hopeful note, thank you so much, Dr. Braddock. It was absolutely a pleasure to talk to you.
You're very welcome, and thank you, everybody.
Thank you.